please welcome Anna Eskamani.
Thank you. It was great. It was great. Awesome job. I love it. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. It is such a joy to share space with you today. And seriously, to the Creative Mornings team, what a phenomenal purpose to come together on a Friday morning to share space, to seek for our inner creative perspectives, and to, of course, work to find opportunities to work together and collaborate here in the City Beautiful. I'm really excited that I get to be a part of this. I actually was able to attend a Creative Morning a few weeks back with Ricardo and got to see Ricardo talk about his filmmaking paths and creativity behind that. And so once I attended one, I was like, yeah, I'm hooked. I definitely want to be part of this space. And so I'm going to talk a little more about how I came to public service as a part of my talk. But of course, I really just want to start with this big question around vision. And when I was asked what dates I would pick, of course, I picked the date like right before the elections, LOL. Because when you're busy is the best time to get everything done at the same time. And so I do have an election in like 10 days, but who's counting? But for me, this concept of vision also really spoke to me, but it's kind of a big question, right? Like the term vision, you can go in any direction with a talk. And oftentimes when I lead different types of educational trainings on civics or how a bill becomes a law, folks often ask this question of, well, where does that idea come from, right? Where do you build a vision from? And so I really thought about this question a lot as I built out this presentation, because I think a lot of folks might assume that as an elected official that we have a lot of vision. And sometimes those visions are terrible, and sometimes they might be more reflective of our collective values. But in the day, that vision came from somewhere, and so where did it come from? And then I started thinking more about having a vision, but how do you actually make that vision become a reality? And so this distinction between visionary versus a planner. And so I wanted to kind of throw it out to you guys for a second. What do you think the differences are between someone who's a visionary versus someone who's a planner? What are some concepts that come to mind or words that come to mind when you kind of see the contrast between the two? And I'll just open it up for the floor. You can yell it out. Yeah.
I think one comes up with the ideas, but actually does not follow through. So they come up, they're the idea person, and then the planner is the one that actually implements the infrastructure and the foundation to actually make that vision become a reality.
Totally. I think I have one up here too.
I was going to say it's the difference between the magical and the practical.
The magical and the practical. I love that. Yeah.
The visionary, it can see the big picture, and the planner is that you can see how to bring the big picture.
All right. Yeah.
I think it's a combination of listening and then having insights that you can implement into an innovative forward motion.
Love that. That's so well said. Any other thoughts back here? Visionary versus planner. I love this magical versus practical dynamic. I'm wondering, are there names that come to mind, like in the tech space or in the business space or educational space, where there's some executives that you see more as visionaries, or maybe even creative minds in film, where there's vision versus the implementers? Yeah, Ricardo?
I often think about how Steve Jobs, who's a very big name obviously in tech, the history of business, is not a developer. It's not somebody who ever touched a computer in that way and understands something in that perspective, but had a great vision of what he wanted his products to be, which is incredibly fascinating.
Yeah. Versus Tim Cook, right? Exactly. Yeah, good contrast. Any other contrasts y'all can think about?
Left brain, right brain.
Yeah, left brain versus right brain, 100%. Sometimes it's also the difference between, some might contrast it as heart versus mind, right? People who have the heart for the work versus those who have the logistical mindset for it. Yeah, these are all really great examples. Now the challenge for me as an elected official is that the expectation, right, is that not only are we visionaries, we also are planners. Because when I'm on the campaign trail, when I'm talking about the issues that I care about, I can't just paint you the picture, I also have to get it done. And so it's definitely a challenge, but it's also helped me understand that I believe firmly that every person can be a visionary and a planner. And part of my talk today will be helping folks coach through that. Where do you build that vision, but also how do you implement that vision for it to become a reality? And when I look in this space, I see small business owners, I see entrepreneurs, I see creative minds who are already doing this every single day. But there also might be some folks in the space who think, well, I'm not a visionary, I'm a doer. But I want you to leave this room this morning understanding that each one of us can have a vision and we can have a plan to get it done. And so the first question that I asked myself when I was putting together this presentation was, where does a vision come from, right? Where does my vision come from? As someone who cares deeply about this community, who wants to lift people out of poverty, who wants to solve problems that can help someone reach their fullest potential, where did that vision come for me? Because when I first made the decision to run for office, one of the first questions are, what do you want to do? Why are you running? And to answer that question requires a lot of deep reflection, because it's not something you should just wake up in the morning and say, aha, I'm going to put my name out there, spend hundreds of thousands of dollars, get attacked along the way, and then get to the Florida House and do what with that, right? And by the way, it's a part-time job. So my salary is $28,000. So I have to be a public servant also having another source of income. So it's not a job for, those who don't have focus, believe it or not. I know sometimes in Tallahassee, it's hard to know that. But so I started thinking about, what are some of the sources of a vision? So you have cultural and societal context. Maybe there's spiritual, philosophical beliefs that are the source of your vision. Future thinking, strategic insight, imagination, creativity, as we were saying earlier, the magical dynamic, inspiration from others. I see so much inspiration from others, from people around me, mentors in my life, teachers that invested in me. Of course, you might just have a vision from research. I'm a PhD in public affairs. One of the first books that I read in my PhD program is called Evicted, and it tells the story of landlords and tenants in two different communities in the city of Milwaukee, a more rural community, a more urban community, and even just reading those experiences from this sociologist inspired me to have a vision for the need for renters to have better safety nets, right? So sometimes research can be that source of a vision. Community and collaboration, coming together with like-minded people, can lead you to build out a vision. So I started thinking more about this element of lived experiences. Because again, I believe firmly that every person can have a vision because every person has lived experiences that impact the way they see the world. And so when we think about our lived experiences and the stories that define our lives, every single story fits this framework of a challenge, choice, outcome. So if you think about some of your favorite films, right? I'm a big Star Wars nerd, so I'm gonna go to Episode 4, A New Hope, right? You have Luke Skywalker, who faces a challenge. He loses, his entire family in Tatooine, and he's given a choice. Does he stay in Tatooine on the Moisture Farm, try to rebuild his life there, or does he follow Obi-Wan Kenobi to save Princess Leia? That was a challenge and a choice that he faced. He made the choice to take down the Death Star, right? And there's this incredible outcome with a moral that is gained from that story. So every part of our personal lives, there's a moment where we faced a challenge, we made a choice, and there was an outcome. And that outcome is not only impacting our lived experiences, but it leads to us developing our value system for how we see the world and also how we treat others or how we mentor others or our perception of risk, our perception of what the future holds are defined by the challenge, choice, outcomes that we face every day in life. Even today, you're gonna be faced with challenge, choices, and outcomes that might feel really small in your life, but have much bigger consequences when you look at the trajectory of your lived experiences. And of course, it follows a plot line, right? And you don't know the end of your plot line, if you will, but each one of us are living across these individual experiences, right? That intersect with one another in our own storylines. But this notion of challenge, choice, outcome, I started thinking more deeply about when it comes to my own lived experiences, because at the end of the day, stories are what lead to emotions, and that's what defines our values, which shape our vision for the future. And going back to this contrast between a visionary and a planner, the power of storytelling also helps us to connect our values to a vision to then inspire others to actually take action with us so that we can connect the story of yourself, the story of self, to the story of us. Does that make sense? And so I wanted to use my personal story and how I developed my vision as an example to go back to this framework of challenge choice outcome. So stick with me here. So it was mentioned in my bio that I grew up in Orlando. So these are actually photos from UCF, other UCF Knights in the space. Go Knights, charge on. So this is my dad, and I do have a twin sister. Most folks, I think, know that. You'd be surprised how many folks don't. They'll see her at sunroom and be like, hey, are you the rep? My poor sister's just like trying to have a drink. But so I have a twin sister, I have a big brother. And so we grew up in East Orange County. My dad went to UCF in 1994. And the three of us went to public schools. My parents are both immigrants from Iran. So that's a big part of my value system and lived experience is that my parents came to this country with nothing. They sacrificed so much for their children. Hard work and education was always paramount to me. I grew up one of those families that if I got a B in class, I was in trouble. And so that was a very fundamental values experience for me growing up in Orlando. And of course, like so many kids, we were in a working class family, rocking the Barney and Baby Bop fanny packs over here for any 90s kids in the space. But my mom, who's without a doubt one of the most important people in my life, worked multiple jobs to make ends meet. She was at fast food restaurants, eventually at Kmart, which really dates me because the last Kmart like just closed and like last week, I think. But there were many nights where my sister and I would be at Kmart with my mom, helping her to fold clothes and get out of that store at a decent time. And unfortunately, my mom was actually diagnosed with cancer when I was about 9 years old. And I was her caregiver during that time. And at the tender age of 13, she passed away after that long fight. And so going back to this framing, right, of challenge, choice, outcome, for us, going through that experience with my mom, it not only, of course, carries this huge weight of just deep grief, but in that grief, I had a choice to make. Was I going to crawl into a ball and isolate myself and fall deeper into that sadness? Or was I going to honor my mom's life in a different way? And so I made that choice. And literally, she passed away on a Saturday in January 2004. And we went to school that Monday. And a part of it for me, again, was the importance of public education, was making sure that I wasn't going to falter in that path. But also, school is my family, school is my community. And that's why today I care so deeply about ensuring that public schools are here for all of our kids, that we're not going to restrict access to books or restrict access to education. Because for me, to see kids like me in my textbook, to read stories like mine in my chapter books in my library was critical to my health and well-being. So again, going back to where does a vision come from? It's based in that lived experiences of challenge, choice, outcome. And speaking of making choices, I mentioned my commitment and my passion for literature. So I actually was a really shy kid growing up, if you can imagine it. I hated sticking out. I didn't talk out of line. In fact, being an immigrant kid, we were told to just study physics, chemistry, biology, and not attract attention to ourselves. So as I was growing up, that was my focus, was do good at school, but don't attract attention. So we were in the library during a 20-minute break between classes. This is back in third grade. And all my classmates had found the books that they wanted and were leaving the library. And so that clock was ticking. Again, I'm a third grader who doesn't want to get in trouble, who doesn't want to get attention. So I start having an anxiety about not finding the book that I was looking for. And that anxiety led me to build up the courage to ask the librarian for assistance, which was really hard for me at the time. And so I just quietly went to the library and I said, hey, I'm looking for this book. Can you help me find it? And within seconds, she found this book for me and she put it in my hand. And that's when it clicked for me. It's not that hard to speak up. It's not that hard to ask for help. And when you do so, good things happen. So again, another example, right? Very small example of challenge, choice, outcome. But it also led me to not only find my own voice, but to help be that voice for others around me. So again, a vision doesn't have to come from this monumental, well-recorded moment in history, right? The vision doesn't have to come from someone who is making a profit off a product. A vision can come from any part of your life, small or big. And when this happened to me when I was in 3rd grade, it felt incredibly small. But when I look back at it now as a 30-year-old person, you know, it feels much different, right? The weight of it feels much stronger. And so, of course, now you can't find me like not talking, right? And in the legislature, advocating for our community, in the streets, fighting for reproductive rights and helping to get out the vote. And so I look back to just my own lived experiences and how that led to my vision for the work that I do. And I really do credit it to just the people who impacted me, the people who believed in me, and of course to the problems that I've identified and the hope to solve them. So talking a little bit more about the practical, because I'm actually a very practical person, being a elected official, but also a researcher with my PhD program. We do, of course, exist in theoretical spaces. In fact, my dissertation, if you're interested, was on crisis communications. I use Reddit as my data source and crisis communication theories as my foundation to analyze that data. So I can talk about theory all day, but I think when it comes to solving problems, at the end of the day, you need practical advice to get it done. And so I do a lot of leadership trainings, and I was lucky to actually, of course, be exposed to leadership trainings, and now I get to be a teacher myself. So this actually comes from Marshall Gantz and their literature on people, power, change. And if you haven't looked up this literature before, I definitely encourage you to do so, because it really follows through not just this framing of the power of storytelling, but also how do you actually build relationships with people to invite them to join you in your collective vision. And whether that is pitching to a potential funder, right, to invest in your work, or pitching to volunteers to help you implement something, or trying to recruit a new hire. This curriculum really does provide incredible advice and guidance to create a work environment that isn't vertical, that instead is horizontal. And so instead of having this kind of more traditional hierarchical structure, right, where there's a boss and people under it, it helps to encourage a leadership structure where we're all equals. We do, of course, have approvers and managers, but it's going to be in a framework where instead of there being hierarchical lines, there's commitments of accountability. So for me and my team, it creates an environment where no one is scared to talk to the boss, right? It's not as corporate as some of our larger companies are, but instead creates a space where it can be more collaborative and more shared. And that's what the snowflake model of leadership embraces. But I do want to acknowledge these other two dynamics of leadership that we have all faced in different environments, whether they're back in our college days or in our workforce days today. For example, this model of I'm the leader, right? So this is where you have a situation where one person is in charge, one person controls everything, and what happens when that one person disappears? Everything falls apart, right? And so the I'm the leader structure sometimes works in short term when you have an ad hoc vision, something very quick. But as we see, especially with turnover within organizations, if you're not building new leaders, if you're not sharing your vision and those practical skills with others, this is not sustainable. And then you have a model of we're all leaders. So this is where, again, instead of having just one person in charge, you have multiple people in charge, but they're all working in different directions. And so in this case, you have a lot of people with great vision, but they're not talking to each other, not working together. So in this case, practically speaking, nothing gets done. So the snowflake model leadership, I'm very pro snowflake, if you can tell, also known as the interdependent leadership model. This is what I described earlier. So you do have one person who's kind of the main anchor in charge, but then of course you have the managers that they work with, and then those managers are training their own leaders within the environment. So if for some reason, if this person has to step out, you have another person ready to succeed in taking that vision, to continue implementing that plan. So when it comes to having a vision, but sharing it with others and training others to fulfill your vision, this is the best leadership structure for that to be possible. And I'm not sure if folks ever use MOCA as a management tool. Has anyone heard MOCA before? Okay, one person. So for those who haven't used Mocha, I also use it with my team when it comes to project management. So it's an acronym, right? MOCHA. M stands for manager, O stands for owner, C stands for consultant, H is helper, and A is approver. So whenever we have major projects or just constituent services that can dive into many different issues, we'll use Mocha as a management tool to basically distinguish responsibilities within this snowflake model. So in some cases, for example, when we get letters from the incarcerated community members, I have one team member who's the owner of responding, helping to respond to those letters, compared to if we get food stamp inquiries, another member is the owner of that. So it helps you streamline the goals you have within your organization when you are operating in what is a more horizontal leadership structure. Because you still need to have distinguished responsibilities, right? So that helps us maintain the focus while also creating an environment where everyone is a leader at the same time. Everyone is building that vision, implementing that vision at the same time. So how you can start, right? Because it wouldn't be a presentation with Dr. Eskamani, LOL, if I couldn't offer you some advice, right, on how to get started. So I spoke to this earlier, but it's okay to start small, right? Like, finding your vision doesn't have to happen in large public forums. It's not viral videos. It's not these inspirational speeches. Like, again, every single person in this room has experienced a challenge choice outcome that inspires you to do what you do today, whether you know it or not. It always frustrates me when someone tells me, well, I don't have a story. Nothing happened in my life that is inspirational. And I'm like, that is not true. Like, you're just not digging deeper enough. You're not giving yourself that grace, right? Like, you are a creative person because you were inspired at some point in your life. So there has to be that challenge choice outcome. And again, if you're comparing your story to other stories, that's where the problem is. Like, you have to start with your origin story and not someone else's. And so it's totally okay to start small. Maybe it's having a meeting, with a group of friends or a text thread or something that is more introverted. If you're an introvert, it's totally fine to start small with crafting that vision. Number 2, understand goals versus tactics. This one is really important to me as someone who also does community organizing, because I meet and really just high energy and passionate people all the time. But I ask them, okay, what is your vision and what are your goals and what are your tactics? I can't get clear answers, right? So a goal versus a tactic. So goals are the steps needed to accomplish a vision. Tactics are the steps you take within that goal, okay? So I'll give you a quick example. So yesterday morning, we worked with a IVF clinic here in Orlando to host a roundtable discussion with doctors and patients about the 6-week abortion ban and the dangers of the 6-week abortion ban here in Florida. So the conversation was not partisan. The conversation was really centered on doctors and patients. I wanted to bring the conversation back to healthcare because obviously it gets very political and partisan, especially if you watch television. That's all we see on our commercials. So I wanted to anchor that conversation in the purpose of Amendment 4 and what that would mean for the health and well-being of women in our state. Doing that press conference was not a goal, it was a tactic. Because my goal is to inspire people to get out to vote and to vote yes on 4, transparently. That is my goal, right? The tactic was hosting the press conference to bring these voices to the table to hopefully get media attention. And in fact, if you open up the Orlando Sentinel today, the front page of the Orlando Sentinel is our roundtable. And so, but my goal wasn't to get on the front page. That was a tactic, because I want to make sure that if you're going to see the paper at the gas station or go to their website online or you get a news alert, or you're going to see a group of doctors coming together to speak about their experiences during this 6-week ban and why it's so dangerous to women's health care. And so that's a distinction, right, between a tactic and a goal. If your goal is to get press coverage, then I would question you on that goal, because it shouldn't be to get attention, right? That's a very superficial goal. So think about that distinction, right, between a tactic and a goal. And then again, I know I said this earlier, but I really want to close on this point, that everyone is a visionary, right? But I actually do believe, and you can push back on this if you want, I actually think being a visionary is not the hard part. I think being the implementer is the hard part. Because again, I think everyone is a visionary, everyone has big, bright ideas, but translating that into real-time action, I think that's when shit gets tricky. Because that's when you're navigating resources, that's when you're navigating personalities, that's when you're navigating the eco environment you're operating in, right? Like in my case in Tallahassee, like I got some really great bill ideas, but to get that through a supermajority legislature that's oppositional to my values, that's where things get tricky, right? And so everyone here has a vision, but to think more critically about how do I actually implement that? Who do I need with me in the room, right? Under that leadership structure to get it done. That's the magic for me. That's the special sauce for me. And so with that, I want to say thank you so much for your time. I'm excited to take your questions, and kudos again to Creative Mornings for having me today. Thanks, y'all.
All right, we have several minutes now for questions, so now's your time to answer from the representatives, so take advantage of this moment.
And no question is a silly question.
I'll take us on just to get it started.
Yeah.
Obviously, I love your presentation. You were fantastic. And I love the bits about leadership and different leadership structures. And I love that you pointed out the book, which is very important for the kind of work that she does. And for a lot of the work most people do, actually. But the one question I have for you is, I never really thought about this until your presentation. But what happens in a situation where you have someone in the leader structure,
Right.
where they're not necessarily wanting that structure, but they're placed into it? And I don't recall, from my experience, how to deal with that. That's what, as you were talking about, I was like, how would somebody handle that? And I couldn't remember what the answer was.
Yeah. I'll repeat the question in case folks didn't hear it. So what happens when you inherit this leadership structure by accident? So, and I can think of examples where this could happen. I mean, for example, maybe you work at a company, and again, the boss has always had this I'm the leader structure, and the boss disappears for some reason. Maybe they get indicted, I don't know. But they disappear, right? They disappear. And so someone has to inherit, right? Like that responsibility. And so, I mean, my recommendation would be that if that's what happens, right? You find yourself in a situation that you try really hard to remodel this ASAP, right? And we see sometimes it happens, right? Where companies make these dramatic decisions of laying off staff or bringing on new leadership team members. And sometimes we cringe at that because change is scary. But I do think that if the change is trying to get out of this structure into a new one, it's going to be sustainable. The challenge too with the I'm the leader model is at the end of the day, when you only have one person calling the shots, it doesn't create room for that leadership development. So what you might find yourself in is when you evolve in that situation is that you look around you and you might not have anyone you can even bring up. So you might have to hire new staff or reach into your personal networks to bring more people into the space to create a snowflake model. Now, one of the pros of this model, because not every model is negative, but one of the pros is, it's only one person to make a decision. So if you have to make fast decisions, maybe you're a smaller organization, then this model actually will serve you well in the short term. It's just not gonna serve you well in the long term. And so if you do find yourself in this situation, you also have to ask yourself, is this a long-term or short-term purpose? Is the intent of this organization to implement a vision that's a year out, or is it a very short-term, month-out vision? If it's only a month out, then I actually think this is fine. But if you're trying to sustain something over time, this is never going to get you there. Do you have a follow-up, or?
No, I was going to say, it's a very alluring, even if you're not somebody that wants to be in that position, to someone else looking at it, it's an alluring position to have.
Of course,
So
yeah.
the people around you have to either be educated that, well, you have to understand the pitfalls of what it is to that. So it's like, again, I'm going back to the book and thinking like, what would be the solution? It's so challenging to think about it. And if somebody sees you in that role, and like, oh, I want to subjugate people as well. That's the extreme version, but like that's what some people see. Like if you look at a dictator, they're like, well, it's bad to be a dictator, but I want to be. If I'm the person in power, it's not bad for me.
Yeah.
It's bad for everybody else. So it's like, how do you combat those scenarios?
Well, and what's interesting too, I mean, you said it with the dictator term. It's so interesting because I do feel like with this model, a lot of folks also are attracted to, while others are not. So you end up surrounding yourself with folks who are kind of yes people, right? Because those are, and again, those are not necessarily going to be leaders or be followers, but people who have a sense of independence are typically not even attracted to this model. So you're not going to necessarily have like people around you to question your authority, to make you, I would argue, a better leader, right? By challenging you. So it's kind of self-destructive. It's almost impossible for this to be a long-term leadership structure. Because I do think that you will self-destruct at the end of it.
So empires crumble.
Yes, Empire Strikes Back, baby. No, but for we're all leaders, to highlight this model too, I don't know if anybody ever was a part of the Occupy movement back in the early 2000s. So I was a college student, and there was the Occupy movement was taking place over in Lake Ivanhoe. I'm dating myself now. And part of that movement was there was no leader, and all decisions were made by a vote, I guess through democracy. So people would do like jazz hands to demonstrate support for an issue, or they would, basically it was everything was like group done. And it was this really like beautiful utopia in the sense of, yeah, like this is so cool, like everyone makes decisions together. But then when conflict happened, there was like no clear way to resolve that conflict. Because then personalities started showing up, and people believed what this person said, not this person said, just based on their personal judgment, not based on fact. And so you kind of, again, got into this structure where it just wasn't sustainable. And indeed, most folks in this room probably haven't even heard of Occupy, right? But at the time, it was a big deal. And so it's just one of those examples of like, when you have a vision and you want to actually sustain it, every like well-established organization that leads in social justice, for example, from NAACP to Planned Parenthood to Equality Florida, to all these organizations that a lot of us follow when we look towards for guidance, more often than not, they have interdependent leadership structures. And these are organizations that have existed for decades, right? And of course, they will revisit their strategic plans. They will rewrite their missions or organizational missions. But the overlying values that define their vision always stay the same. And again, when you're thinking of that long-term sustainability, this is the structure that you always want to implement. Other questions? Yeah.
How do you, so in larger organizations, you might have actually either one structure or all three, or two.
Right.
How do you, if you are in this structure, which is actually, yeah, like I actually see that, especially in creative, we are, team members, collaborating, like that is kind of like the crucial piece. For the most part, people
Right.
have to be the same organization, deal with people in other side. How is,
Yeah.
I guess I don't have a specific question, but how to balance it? I
Yeah.
guess, or how can you make it contagious? Or like,
Yeah. How to teach it to others, or it's a really good question. And again, I go back to my own lived experiences. Sometimes like this structure is also facilitated by pride and ego, right? And I'll go back to when I was in high school. So my twin sister and I, we were thespians, if you can tell, in high school. But I actually wasn't an actress, I was a techie. So I did props, costumes, set pieces. And my twin sister and I were so prideful of the work that we did in our high school theater program that when we graduated, we didn't teach new prop and costume liaisons. Like we did not embrace this model leadership. Like we did not train other people. We were basically like this. We're the ones in charge, we know what we're doing, no one's gonna replace us. And so we left and never built new leaders. I go back to the theater productions next year. Now I'm a freshman at UCF, and the props were terrible. And I was like, where'd all the props go? Like, what happened? And the theater director told me, well, you never trained anyone. And that really hit me hard as a 19-year-old. So I was like, oh my God, like that was my responsibility night, because I was so, to some degree, in my own world of having my pride and ego, I wasn't willing to share that power with someone else. And that's ultimately what this is about, right? It's about sharing power. And power is not a scarce resource. Unfortunately, in our society, we often define it as being a zero-sum game, that I only have power if you don't have power. But power is infinite. There's no scarcity to human dignity. We build it together. And so I think part of it is helping people to understand that mindset, that when you're interacting with this type of leadership structure, to see, and again, I don't know how effective this conversation would be with a larger kind of figurehead, but if you're talking about at a smaller level, a peer-to-peer conversation around, hey, like, you know, who's gonna replace you when you go, right? Like, you're not gonna be here forever. Let's think about building power with your peers, teaching what you know to others around you, and realizing that just because I teach you how to use Photoshop, for example, doesn't mean I'm becoming less relevant. If anything, like, it takes weight off my shoulders because I can ask you to help me design something versus me doing it all by myself, right? So I think it's rethinking the mindset that when you, especially are working with folks who have vision and are very protective of that vision, to help them understand that your vision will be more clearly implemented when you have others around you that share in that collective vision. And that's what the Snowflake model leadership will do. So I think it's a one-on-one conversation, but also understanding that power is not a scarce resource. We build it together. It's not a zero-sum game. And if we can get out of that mindset of scarcity, I think you'll see more and more structures like this versus, you know, I'm the leader vibes. So great question. What else we got? Yeah.
You were saying before that when you're working with like high energy, like passionate people, sometimes the goals and like the tactics that aren't like super like solid and
Yeah.
thought out like that. How do you like help like focus on the steps to take, and how do you know like when to take a step back and when you're not ready to speak up? That's like you're.
Yeah, that's such a great question. So it's hard because, so first off, did everyone hear the question? Folks heard the question? Okay. Let me repeat it? Okay, I'll repeat it. So basically, I mentioned earlier how, you know, I work with a lot of young, passionate leaders that don't know the difference between tactics and goals. And they have such great passion, but not necessarily a strategy to get it done. So when you meet those folks, like, how do you actually try to coach them, right? And so the first question is, are they willing to even be coached? Because I do think you have to have that consent, right? Like, I can't just come in and you know, to some degree, attempt to teach you, which is probably gonna feel condescending, right? Like, you just can't come into a space and assume that you know, folks are even going to be open to your suggestions and feedback. So trust is the first step. What do you do to build trust with those individuals? Now, in my case, I work really closely with high school and college students all the time. I try to be accessible when they need me. So we are building that trust so that if I offer feedback, it comes from a place of wholeheartedness, right? Not a place of shame or embarrassment, but from a place of coaching. And part of that is we also host a lot of youth trainings on college campuses. In fact, 2 weeks ago, I was just at UCF. We hosted an event, thanks Ricardo. We hosted an event called Know Your Ballot UCF Nights. And we actually had like 60 students come out. It was awesome. And I basically reviewed the ballot with everyone and took questions. And so part of it is, what can you do to create an environment for learning and growing? And of course, that's a large scale example, but maybe it's just, hey, let's go grab coffee and talk, right? Maybe it's just opening up the door for a mentorship conversation, but it's not gonna happen in one conversation. And that's a really important defining feature here. Like, when I knock on doors to get to know voters and inspire them to join our vision, it's often like 3 to 4 conversations with that voter, right? It's not just one experience with that voter to build trust. And so when you're meeting and interacting with folks that, again, you might align on values, but there's just no clear direction of a vision, I think a part of it is building trust with that individual or that organization in small ways so you can build that long-term relationship where not only are they going to be open to mentorship, but they're actually going to ask for it. They're going to request it. They're going to come to those opportunities to learn and grow. And so that's my piece of advice. But it will take time. And again, I think one of the challenges that I face, and I'll be very candid with y'all, you know, politicians are some of the most like untrustworthy, positions in the country. And I'm not saying that to be hyperbolic, like when you poll people on who they trust like less, politicians are always like number one, right? And so when I ran for office and inherited this title, right, as politician, I inherited a lot of baggage from other politicians. And that's nothing to do with me, right? Like I just started, but at the same time, like I have to unpack that. I have to acknowledge that and kind of start from scratch, right? Of redefining public service. And that's not easy to do when you're talking to folks who have historically been marginalized by their elected officials, neglected by their elected officials. I remember when I first started representing the historic town of Eatonville. So for those who don't know, Eatonville is the first established African-American town in this country. And when I first got elected, Eatonville was not in my district. So I inherited Eatonville during redistricting, which took place back in 2022. So 2022 was the first year I was potentially going to represent this historic community. And when I was knocking on doors for the first time, rightly so, a lot of folks were like, no one comes here. People ask for a vote, they never show up, right? And where have you been, right? And I had to kind of explain, oh, well, I wasn't representing Eatonville before, now I am. And we're gonna be different, we're going to be different. And when you are trying to build that trust, right, especially with populations and communities who've always had distrust, that again, back to my original point, the vision is one thing, but implementation is something else. And so we gave them our vision that we're gonna be engaging your community, we're gonna be here on the ground, supporting you and growing with you. And then once we actually start serving the community, we better uphold that shared vision through implementation, or we're gonna go back to a place of distrust, right? So it's definitely not easy, but it always starts with building that trust. And I think once you can get through that relationship of mutual understanding, then the coaching and the teaching and the mentorship will blossom from there. Absolutely. All right, what else do we got? These are great questions. Yeah.
So going back to your story about your book in third grade, I'm someone who's pretty independent and like I don't really have an easy time asking for help. So do you have any like advice for maybe some of young people who kind of have a hard time reaching out?
Yeah, that's a great question. So do you have any advice for young people who have difficulty asking for help? That's really, first of all, it's a very vulnerable question. Like, can we give a round of applause for that question? Like, you literally just said that you struggle to ask for help and you just asked for help. Like, that is amazing. So my first piece of advice is like, keep doing that. Like, keep doing that, right? But let's take the elevator down a little bit. And I'll speak to myself as an example because I never want to speak for someone else. So why was I so scared to ask for help, right? I think a part of it was growing up in an immigrant family, my parents never wanted us to attract attention. They wanted us to fit in. They wanted to assimilate. I mean, both my parents had their Iranian names and they had their American names. So my mom's Persian name was Nasreen. Everyone called her Nancy. My dad's real name is Behruz, but everyone called him Bruce. So when you come from an immigrant family, right, your parents are often just trying to like fit in, not cause a stir, and asking for help is seen as a burden, right? So for me, it was unpacking that and trying to let go of that feeling that if I ask for help, I'm being a burden. So, and that's still hard for me, don't get me wrong. Like, I still, I hate when people worry about me. Like, that's when I just, I don't, like when something negative happens to me, I'm hesitant to tell people not because I don't want to share, but it's like, I don't want you to worry about me because I'm gonna be fine. I think a lot of women do that too, honestly, like we kind of compartmentalize those emotions. So a part of it is unpacking that, right? And trying to let go of that feeling that I'm being annoying or I'm being a burden to someone else if I ask for help. And of course for me, I am a giver, so I give with that expectation. So I think if you practice that act of giving, it also give you grace for yourself when you ask for help. So you don't have to carry on this like sense of I'm being annoying. When you also give yourself the grace to say, I have been so helpful to so many people, it's okay if I need help too, right? And you'll be surprised too, like, just based on your network and your relationships, how many people want to help. And I think that's also something we have to get over, is that a lot of people in our lives want to be there. They want to help us, but we can't read minds, so we have to ask. We've been seeing this, by the way, with a lot of our small businesses in town. Like, we assume that when we go into a small business, they're doing great because we usually show up when, it's lunchtime or brunch time, but we're not there on the Tuesday afternoon when no one's there. And so we've been seeing more and more of our small businesses ask for help. Like the Hammer Lamb is asking for help, Maxine Sunshine is asking for help. So that transparency is very brave. So embrace the courage in making that ask, right? Again, it's not a burden to ask for help. I actually think it's incredibly brave. All right, other questions? Yeah, you want to applaud? Yes, girl, go ahead. I love that. Other questions? Yeah, please.
How do you deal with being a super cool, bubbly personality, but also being taken seriously?
Yeah, oh my God, that's such a great question. Well, I can be any Barbie I want, right? So, part of it is you can embrace all the all the realities of your life. And so I'm a very positive person, 100%, but one of my favorite quotes is, do no harm, but take no shit. So if you're gonna go after my community, honey, you know what I mean? We're gonna go to the mat. And so I think a part of it is, when I'm on the House floor advocating for our community, I'm never gonna do it in a way that's shaming. So I'm not so there is an approach you can take, right? And go back to tactics and goals, right? And at the end of the day, if I'm an inclusive person, then I'm gonna believe in the power of evolution. And I don't think people evolve when you're condescending or mean or embarrassing towards them, right? And in fact, I was on a polling call the other day and they were talking about how do you talk to folks who come from a different perspective? And how do you combat misinformation? And one of the terms that they encourage we use is, you might be surprised to hear that what you said isn't right. Or you might be surprised to hear that so-and-so actually brought up this point. This notion of you might be surprised to hear gives that person you're talking to permission to potentially be wrong, versus starting the sentence with, you're wrong, here's why. So it's kind of interesting to me too, right? How a specific word or phrase can open up someone to wonder, to learning, to growing, to joining you in your vision, versus if you started from a place that's more, kind of conflict oriented. And the irony in my life, I'm actually very anti-confrontation and anti-conflict, and yet I embrace a role where I have to confront people all the freaking time, and I'm surrounded by conflict all the time. So it is also about getting out of your comfort zone, right? That's a part of it too. And so when I am having to discuss an issue that's much more elevated and escalated, I do try to ground myself in being firm but direct, having grit and having grace. But my intention is not to shame or embarrass you. If you do that yourself, that's not my problem, right? If I ask you tough questions you don't have the answers to, not my problem. In fact, I had a bill in front of me during one of my committee meetings. It was one of the anti-diversity, equity, and inclusion bills. And this time they were going after teacher preparation materials. So basically eliminating all DEI in teacher education materials. So I asked the bill sponsor in committee, I said, well, would your bill impact the ability for teachers to understand redlining, which is important because it would determine, right, the economic experiences of your students? And his response to me was, I don't know what that is. And I was like, oh my God, you have a bill about DEI and you don't know what redlining is? You should not be sponsoring this bill right now, right? But at the same time, instead of clapping back immediately, I looked at the chairwoman, I said, can I explain to him what redlining is, right? And so by me doing that, it was definitely the more friendly route to take, but it was still schooling him at the same time, right? And I didn't have to do it in a way that was negative or condescending. I could get it done in a way that isn't just impacting him, but hopefully is impacting other people in the room. Because that's the last thought I'll add to this question. When you are speaking, whether it's a public space like this or testifying in a committee room or speaking at a board meeting, it's not always about the person you're trying to influence in front of you, it's the people around you. And when I'm on the House floor, I know I don't always have the votes to stop a bill. I know that. But at the same time, my voice and my microphone is my weapon of choice to influence the direction of policy beyond those chamber doors. Because if I can't control the votes, I can at least try to influence public opinion and engagement of what we're doing, what we're trying to do. So hopefully lead to changes at the ballot box or in our communities. So to also think about who is my audience, right? And the reality is that I think the everyday American is exhausted by negativity. And so having positivity, regardless of how hard the circumstances are, is a much more effective way to implement your vision than being negative and being, condescending or even like using fear mongering. Like obviously there are things I'm scared about. I'm not gonna, be coy about that, but I don't consider fear to be like my implementation of a vision. Because I don't think fear mongering is sustainable. I think fear mongering leads to self-isolation and it doesn't build long-term change. And so my approach is different, but I do feel like it's a direction that invites more people to join us, even if they historically didn't support us. And at the end of the day, if you believe in the evolution of people, you have to be willing to welcome folks who maybe they were one of your biggest opponents, right, at some point in your career, some part of your life, but now you're aligned. And so when you lead with positivity and that type of approach, it welcomes more people to join you in action. So maybe one more question, yeah.
It's actually 2.
Okay, it was 10, I'm watching the clock.
Yeah, one is just like, how do you actually in those moments? Because I've watched, all these debates and stuff like that.
Oh, man.
Just watch you on the floor. And I'm just like, how would you stay so in your body, so grounded? Because it's wretched, to watch. And I always am in so much awe of like watching you, like be able to stay in command of yourself and still like school them and be so clever about it. And like, I really always like perplexed by how you can do that and stay so grounded. Like, is there like the tricks? Is there like, breathing exercises? What the hell is it?
A good therapist. So.
Yeah. And the second thing is, I wanted just to ask you real quick, like what you need right now from me, from
I love that question.
To like, get you through the finish line and like to remain your elected official, but also to get everybody on the ticket. Like,
I love that question.
Like, what do you need?
I love that question. Well, to your first question, I have to go back to this woman right here, my mom. I mean, she's definitely my inspiration every single day. In fact, this necklace that I wear was her necklace, and it's a sign of Persian culture. And it has 3 parts in his wings, and it means good deeds, good thoughts, and good words. So that is fundamental to my values, which again, feed into my vision. And so I'm always thinking about that. Like, because there have been moments on the House floor where I am so tempted to just lose it, right? But again, I remind myself, like, how effective is that going to be? And I'll give you another example. For the near total abortion ban when it passed off the House floor, we were on the House floor till midnight. We had filed 50 amendments to try to stop this bill. We did everything we could. And just by happenstance, I was going to be the last person to debate the bill. And I don't know if y'all know this, but I worked at Planned Parenthood if I ran for office. I have a long history of reproductive rights. That's a part of my origin story. So the pressure, right, to be the closing thoughts on this bill was heavy. And I had to ask myself, am I going to shame this entire chamber, which I had every right to do, and make comments about, well, we should ban vasectomies, right? We can all go down these paths, right, of the double standards that we face. Or was I going to lean on my values and actually try to persuade people through the power of storytelling? And y'all can probably guess, which route I chose. And I'll never forget that night, because as hard as it was, as Democrats, we're in the back rows. So if you ever look at the House floor, despite I'm gonna be a senior going to my last term in the legislature, despite my seniority, we're still in the back rows because we're in the minority. So the way the House floor works is that the first 2 rows in the back are Democrats. Everyone else are Republicans. Committee chairs are the front. So power is defined by your proximity to the speaker. It's a really interesting display of powers on the House floor. And so it was the first time ever that every chair was full, because usually lawmakers aren't on the House floor because they're not voting. So they're like in the members' lounge or in their offices, they're whatever, they're not there. So it was the first time that every chair was full because we're about to vote on this bill, and everyone swiveled facing me. And so you have to ask yourself, back to this question, what is your goal? What is your tactic, right? And if my goal is to try to win the hearts and minds of people watching on this issue, then me being condescending, making snarky comments is not gonna get it done. So I always ground myself, is this gonna build power? If it's not gonna build power, it's not worth my time, right? So that's the question to ask yourself. And even after that debate happened, I had so many Republican colleagues text me and say that was a good debate. Even if I didn't win them over that round, maybe I'll win them over next time, right? And in fact, some of those Republicans that have voted time and time again to ban abortion are voting yes on 4, which is pretty remarkable to me. And sure, it took like 8 years for them to get it right, but I'll fucking take it. You know what I mean? I'm like, that sounds great. Like, please vote yes on 4. And so I was never gonna win those folks over if I didn't carry my values with me in my work. But with that said, self-care is important. Like, I do have a therapist. I actually did not see a therapist until way into my 20s, which is another component of my cultural identity. Like, we just, as an immigrant kid, we just don't do that. And so I had to kind of get over that misconception of what it means to go to a therapist. But that's been very important to managing my trauma and my grief so that I don't show up with trauma. And that's something else too, y'all. Like, every one of us has trauma, especially when we're online and we see these like awful images from around the world and from our communities. So I really do encourage folks to seek that self-care, to seek that mental help, and don't lead with trauma. Because if you lead with trauma, other people are going to get hurt. And that's not I doubt that's your intention, but it does happen that way. So to be very thoughtful in that and how you lead as well. And so what I need, first of all, just thank you for being part of this. What a great way to start a Friday. I encourage every single one, it's a nonpartisan space, so I'll be very thoughtful here, but just go out and vote. If you haven't voted yet, early voting is open right now, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. You can vote at any early vote location here in Orange County, or if you live in a different county, in your county as well. And then spread the word. Don't assume that your network is voting. Like, do not assume that your friends are voting. Check in on them, ask if they have a plan to vote. And of course, election day is November 5th. So if you're voting by mail, make sure that ballot is received by 7 p.m. on election day. Postmarks do not count. So double check. You can track your ballot as well, and just make sure that you actually got it done. And if you got it done, help others do the same. So with that, thank you for your time. This was amazing. I appreciate y'all.